Hey everyone, I'm Mr. Willis, and you will love economics. You can't politicize economic law. Some may try, some may be loud and even sound convincing, but economic law is law. It's true regardless of whether you believe it or not. So when you hear people argue about economics, you're not listening to a debate over the legitimacy of economic law. Chances are, you're listening to different economic viewpoints or opinions. These viewpoints stem from two schools of thought in macroeconomics, the classical theory and the Keynesian theory. The classical theory is founded on the philosophies of Adam Smith, father of laissez-faire economics. Classical economists believe that consumers and firms make decisions in the free market economy in order to maximize their own self-interests. Consumers will make decisions that maximize their own utility, and firms will make decisions that maximize their profits. These self-interests drive voluntary exchange in the free market economy, setting price levels and quantities of output at an equilibrium where all participants can satisfy their incentive-driven goals. When fluctuations and changes occur, the natural market forces of voluntary exchange, also known as the invisible hand, allow the market economy to fix itself without outside influence or government intervention. The Keynesian theory is founded on the philosophies of John Maynard Keynes, father of modern mixed economics. Keynesian economists believe that Adam Smith in the classical theory is correct, but only to a certain point. In many ways, the Keynesian theory is an addendum to the classical theory. Keynesian economists believe that consumers and firms make decisions to maximize their self-interests, and these self-interests drive voluntary exchange in the free market economy, setting price levels and quantities of output at an equilibrium. Sometimes, when fluctuations occur, the economy will fix itself through the natural market forces known as the invisible hand, without outside influence or government intervention. Sometimes, it won't. Keynesian economists believe that there are times when the economy fluctuates and natural market forces completely break down or don't do enough to correct market failures. Without outside influence or government intervention, the imperfect economic conditions will persist and the economy will spiral out of control. As a result, according to the Keynesian theory, government has a role to play to correct the economy when the invisible hand won't, and it has a responsibility to intervene to ensure the social welfare of citizens. Let's take a closer look at the classical and Keynesian theories of macroeconomics, and let's start with the classical theory. The cornerstone of the classical theory is the belief in flexible wages and prices. Flexible wages imply that workers' wages increase with inflation and decrease with deflation. According to classical economists, aggregate demand is comprised of consumer spending, investment spending, and net exports. And aggregate supply is fixed at the economy's full employment quantity of real GDP output. Changes in aggregate demand cause fluctuations in aggregate price level, and real GDP output produced in the macroeconomy remains the same because the economy always produces its potential real GDP output. For example, when consumers, firms, and foreign consumers increase their consumption, aggregate demand increases, causing inflation in the economy. As price levels rise, consumer purchasing power decreases, and so workers will ask for higher wages in order to adjust for inflation. After wages rise, consumption increases, and aggregate demand increases with it, and the economy will experience additional inflation. Eventually, demand pull inflation grows out of control, and prices rise to such a level that consumers, firms, and foreign consumers slow their consumption. Even with wages increasing, consumers just aren't willing to pay excessive prices for goods and services. Think about it. Isn't there a price you're not willing to pay for certain goods and services that you want? The macroeconomy is experiencing excessive inflation that is stifling consumption, and it's in need of correction. According to the classical theory, the correction comes from the natural market forces within the economy itself. As consumption slows, aggregate demand begins to decrease, causing deflation of prices across the economy. As the economy contracts, wages fall with price level, as firms decrease their demand for workers. Now the consumption is slowing. As aggregate demand continues to fall, consumer purchasing power increases, and prices fall to a level that consumers can't help but to buy more goods and services because they are now more affordable. Because of lower prices, consumers, firms, and foreign consumers now have more purchasing power, and they increase their consumption, causing aggregate demand to increase and correcting the economic contraction. The classical theory dictates that periods of recession and excessive inflation are temporary, and the macroeconomy will correct itself through changes in aggregate demand. There's no need for outside influence or government intervention because the invisible hand works through flexible wages and prices, which affect consumption and therefore aggregate demand. According to this theory, this works every time, without failure. The Keynesian theory says that's true, but not all the time. There are times when prices and wages are flexible, and fluctuations in aggregate demand will cause changes in price level and wages, allowing the economy to fix itself as stated in the classical theory. But there are times when the economy fails to fix itself because the invisible hand breaks down, and the only way to correct market failure and return the economy to equilibrium is through government intervention. Keynesian economists believe that there are three ranges of aggregate supply in the macroeconomy: the classical range, the intermediary range, and the Keynesian range. In the classical range, prices and wages are flexible, and the market will correct itself according to the classical theory. When aggregate demand changes, prices and wages change without real GDP changing. In the intermediary range, prices and wages begin to lose flexibility. However, in this range, when aggregate demand changes, both price and real GDP output changes, much like the short-run aggregate supply curve in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. One more thing to note. When the economy moves into the intermediary range of aggregate supply, it is experiencing a recessionary gap. Wait, how do we know that? We mentioned that the classical theory states that the aggregate economy always produces its quantity full employment level of real GDP output, making the real domestic output produced in the classical range QF. Any quantity of real GDP output produced in the short run that is less than QF means the macroeconomy is producing less than its potential. As a result, any equilibrium point in the intermediary or Keynesian range of aggregate supply means that the macroeconomy is in a recessionary gap. In the Keynesian range, prices and wages are sticky. The cornerstone of the Keynesian theory is the belief in sticky wages and prices. Sticky wages imply that workers' wages remain fixed at the same rate regardless of changes in aggregate demand. According to Keynesian economists, when aggregate demand decreases to a point that the economy contracts and enters the Keynesian range of aggregate supply, prices have fallen so low that they become sticky and will not deflate any further. Changes in aggregate demand will cause changes in real GDP output, but prices will remain fixed and will not change. Firms just aren't willing to sell their products for lower prices because they have to make revenue or they'll be forced to shut down. At the same time, wages are also sticky, as workers just aren't willing to work at a lesser wage because they need income to spend. If consumers, firms, and foreign consumers are not consuming economic goods at this deflated price level, they never will. They may be waiting for prices to deflate a little further so that goods and services are more affordable. But that will never happen because prices and wages are sticky and they will not change. As consumption continues to fall, aggregate demand decreases, causing further economic contraction, a wider recessionary gap, and worsening economic conditions. As the unemployment rate increases and income and consumption levels plummet, aggregate demand will continue to fall. Because prices and wages are sticky, the invisible hand is broken, and the economy cannot fix itself. This vicious cycle of economic contraction will continue until either the economy collapses or government can intervene and use policy to stimulate aggregate demand and reverse economic conditions. Not seen it yet? Okay, let's go back to the point in history where Keynesian economics was born, the Great Depression. By 1929, massive consumer spending and investment spending had driven the United States economy to a peak real GDP of $103 billion. But the economy was experiencing inflation, and personal debt and limited income began to stifle consumption levels. Combined with the massive loss of savings and bank failures, and the evaporation of disposable income in the stock market crash, American consumerism plummeted, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed from 3.2% in 1929 to 8.9% in 1930. As firms closed down, the United States real GDP shrank by 10% in 1930, and the country moved into a recessionary gap. Most Americans relied on the classical theory of flexible prices and wages to save the economy. Even President Hoover did, assuring the American people that the economy would fix itself. But as unemployment skyrocketed, the national income level was shrinking at too fast a rate, And even as flexible prices and wages continued to fall into the intermediary range, consumers didn't have enough disposable income to stabilize the economy. As aggregate demand continued to decrease, firms shut down and real GDP contracted by 50%. Between 1929 and 1933, the U.S. economy shrank by $47 billion, and the unemployment rate reached 25%. The economy was in freefall. The solution to the country's economic problems was more consumption and investment. But by 1933, the economy had already entered the Keynesian range of aggregate supply, and prices and wages were sticky. As consumers desperately looked for prices to fall and consumer purchasing power to increase, prices and wages remained stagnant, and consumers were left stranded. If nothing changed naturally to correct the economy, something from outside needed to be the catalyst for growth. In steps Franklin Roosevelt and his new vision for the role of government in the economy. Starting in 1933, New Deal programs focused on direct relief, which put income directly in the hands of consumers, and work relief, which provided jobs for workers who sought steady wages. The New Deal programs would serve to provide the nation with much needed infrastructure, but also stimulate consumer spending by injecting income into the economy when prices and wages remained sticky. By 1937, the United States real GDP nearly doubled, growing from $47 billion to $92 billion. As aggregate demand increased, consumers were gaining purchasing power, allowing them to drive aggregate demand with consumer spending, as government spending continued to generate jobs and income. Eventually, by 1940, the United States unemployment rate was cut to 14%, and as war broke out in Europe, the United States became the supplier of war goods to the Allied powers. This gave American firms the incentive to take out loans and investment spend on factories, workers, and capital, causing real GDP growth and a reduction in unemployment numbers. Income levels rose, and consumer spending jumped, while net exports increased with the flow of war goods and supplies being sold to Britain and France. All in all, by 1942, the United States unemployment rate had been slashed to 4.7%, and the economy had moved back into the intermediary range. Prices and wages were more flexible, and they increased as real GDP increased. The invisible hand was working again, and by 1943, the United States economy was back to full capacity, due in large part to the stimulation of aggregate demand by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs and the massive drive to produce war supplies to win World War II. The Keynesian theory had passed its first test and soon became the most practiced economic theory around the world. And that's classical versus Keynesian theories. Be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red button below so you can receive alerts about new videos when they become available. If you enjoy the channel or find my videos useful, let me know by liking the video and feel free to leave a comment below. We have full video lectures on every topic in macro and microeconomics, as well as quick macro and micro minute videos for cram sessions and quick reviews. If you'd like to learn more, you can click here for my natural economic adjustments video, or you can click here for my economic systems video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. You will love economics.